Today, I'm bringing you a brand new story. It starts off as just another ordinary day in Korea, people walking around, minding their own business. And that guy in the middle, no doubt about it, that's our protagonist. Looking a little closer, he's actually pretty handsome. But seriously, if he keeps staring down at his phone like that, his neck's going to bend into a permanent boomerang. He was so absorbed in his screen that he walked straight into another guy. The dude cursed him out, completely deserved. And our hero apologized like a polite little boy. That, my friends, is the sad and uneventful life of our dude. But while he was busy mentally complaining about how dull everything had become, a loud, ridiculous noise shook the whole area and made everyone freeze. Before anyone could even process what was happening, boom! A second explosion went off. A massive yellow lightning bolt slammed into the ground just steps away and deep-fried a cluster of people on the spot. Everyone stood completely frozen in pure terror. The blast tossed cars around like they were paper airplanes, and then, as if things weren't already terrible enough, more lightning bolts began crashing down. But these weren't your standard lightning strikes. No, these things hit like miniature meteors. People ran like their lives depended on it. Spoiler, they absolutely did. What began as some strange phenomenon escalated into an all-out lightning apocalypse across the entire city. Just picture the destruction caused by a single lightning bolt. Now multiply that by 10,000. Our poor protagonist was just one of thousands sprinting for dear life. A girl near him was also trying to flee, and he spotted his chance to finally be useful for once. He shouted for her to follow him to safety, but apparently she had better luck than him. An ambulance happened to pull up and stop to help her. So she didn't have to run for her life anymore. Actually, she didn't have to run at all, ever again. Our guy went right back to sprinting, partly crying from the trauma and partly because what he just witnessed was straight up terrifying. But fate wasn't done toying with him yet, because right up ahead, a massive truck was lined up perfectly to isekai him into another dimension. And just before it could turn him into protagonist paste, something wild went down. A white flash blinded him and he got pulled into a portal. A lightning bolt, identical to the ones from earlier, came crashing down in a totally different place where it was nighttime. We have no idea how much time passed, but one thing we do know, he survived. He woke up dazed and disoriented, still shaken by Truck Kun, but his focus quickly shifted to something new. Where the hell was he? He looked up and saw something insane. The birds in the sky looked like creatures straight out of a horror game, and there were 2 moons. That definitely wasn't part of the Korea he remembered. That realization hit him harder than the lightning back in the city. And to make matters worse, he was freezing. And not just his hands and feet, I mean freezing absolutely everywhere. One thing was crystal clear. This was definitely not Earth. Looking up, he becomes confused as several monsters are gathered around the area. Bewildered, he asks himself what's going on, and on top of that, why he doesn't have any clothes on. A moment later, the young man stands up, looking startled by something as he comes face to face with a giant bear. However, within seconds, he's attacked by a pack of wolves. The scene then cuts to a doctor analyzing some data, saying that when he woke up, he was on a planet with 2 moons and a forest crawling with monsters, wondering how he managed to come back alive from such a place. However, the young man seemed apprehensive about something. A flashback shows that bear being defeated. Then the wolves begin devouring the bear. The protagonist, watching it all, is desperate. Meanwhile, a white wolf is right behind him. The boy suddenly senses the creature behind him. As a result, he takes off running and doesn't stop. To survive, he gives it everything he's got. At that moment, a system informs him that his constitution has increased to level 1. Seeing all this, the protagonist is confused, but he trips over a rock and starts tumbling downhill, falling off a cliff. However, the boy manages to grab onto some bushes, successfully clinging to life, wondering what that sound from earlier had been. Looking around, he's surprised to find some kind of fruit right in front of him, mentioning that he's starving and wondering if they're even safe to eat. But when he glances to the side, he notices some ants munching on those fruits, so without a second thought, he starts eating them too. But at that very moment, he hears rustling in the bushes and a creature with piercing eyes is watching him. Then a giant snake lunges at the boy. But within seconds, it gets devoured by a giant frog. The young man watching all of this still can't believe what he's seeing. That place is completely insane. But honestly, maybe he's the one who's gone insane. Time passes, and now it's been 67 days since he arrived in that place. On top of that, the pack of wolves from earlier has kept following him and still hasn't given up. That's why the boy fears they might catch him off guard at any moment. Plus, the forest holds things far more dangerous than wolves, so he needs to find somewhere safe. Time passes again, and it's now been a year since he ended up in that place. Looking up, the protagonist spots a giant banana, so he starts grabbing the massive fruit. The system alerts him that his strength has increased to level 1, and you can already tell the boy is pretty ripped. As a result of everything happening around him, the protagonist has been forced to adapt. However, a wolf pup keeps insisting on chasing after him at every turn. That's why he got so used to it that he even missed the little guy when it wasn't around. Meanwhile, something seemed to be falling onto the boy's back. Looking up, he notices something. His expression instantly changes because he just spotted a giant gorilla charging straight at him. However, the young man manages to dodge the attack, snapping the branch he was holding onto, saying he should have better luck next time. As a consequence, the gorilla crashes to the ground, but it was heading toward that wolf and ends up slamming into it. Meanwhile, the protagonist was watching everything unfold. Shortly after, the gorilla gets back up, locks eyes with the wolf that was clearly injured, and begins charging at it. However, the protagonist was already moving toward the gorilla and landed a strike right on its eye. But even that still wasn't enough. So, the gorilla hurls the boy aside. He slams into a tree. Quickly, the monster charges at him again. Annoyed, the young man says that was a really stupid move on the gorilla's part. The scene cuts to the doctor, asking if the protagonist had really done all of that. The boy replies that he couldn't keep running forever from territorial fights, and it wouldn't solve anything anyway, because no matter where he went, there would always be a ruler. Returning to the scenes, the protagonist was about to be attacked by the gorilla. However, the wolf shows up to protect the young man. The boy loses consciousness while the pack tears into the gorilla. He truly thought it was the end, but the wolves didn't attack him while he was knocked out, probably because they thought he had saved the cub earlier, and that little one was the son of the Wolf King, leader of the Crimson Wolves. Time passes after that event, and the wolves were sprinting toward that location. Alongside them, the protagonist was also running with the pack. Glancing to the side, he notices that his little friend was worn out, so he picks him up and starts carrying him once again. Time passes, and it's now been 2 years since the boy ended up in that place. By then, it seemed like they had accepted him as part of the pack. 3 years had now gone by since the young man was stranded, and he seemed to be sharpening his climbing skills. However, he was still in the forest, and in fact, he still hadn't managed to escape that place. On top of that, he hadn't found any sign of civilization. So, he had become a member of the wolf family and kept taking part in territorial battles for the survival of his family. Time passes again, and now it's been 120 years since he was stranded. That's why he assumed he was the only human on the entire planet. In a never-ending battle for survival, he ended up making more friends. But even so, he lost some companions along the way, wondering how long he had really been stranded because he had lost track of the date. And it felt like hundreds of years had gone by, wondering how he was even still alive. The doctor then asks if, after becoming the king of the wolves, even after 500 years, he still hadn't come across any civilization. That's why they wanted to know how he had managed to return to Earth. The boy explains that he had started a war against the gorilla race over Lunar Hill. So a massive battle broke out, and the protagonist was right in the middle of it, charging at one of the gorillas. However, something strange happens as he gets teleported once again, and when he opens his eyes, he's in a totally different place. Meanwhile, a girl appears to be analyzing a radio, saying that something is very strange because the dimensional energy is off the charts. The other guy then tells her to send the coordinates to the portal control team. So the girl does what he asked. At that moment, a portal begins to open. Everyone starts fleeing the area as an explosion erupts, and the impact sends everyone flying to the ground, stunned because a portal really had opened. The other guy, desperate, shouts that he doesn't want to die while the girl is already preparing for an attack, saying she'll buy them time so they should run. The other guy then radios headquarters asking for emergency reinforcements at that location. At that moment, the portal was right in front of the girl. She tells the person to stay back as she's about to slice them apart. At that moment, the silhouette of a man emerges from the portal, leaving the girl completely shocked by what she sees. As a result, she freezes in place. At that moment, the man begins to scream. Then he steps out of the portal. The girl approaches the protagonist, and the other guy is stunned because it really was another person. The girl wonders what that earlier force was all about because it was pressure she had never felt before, not even from high-level dungeon monsters. She wondered what the protagonist even was. So the situation was resolved, and the boy turned out to be a returnee, meaning they needed to call the ambulance right away. And then the scene cuts again to the professor. He thanks the boy for everything. His testimony and medical examination would be shared with the awakened central office. For that reason, he seemed perfectly healthy and should be discharged in a few days. Shortly after, the boy calls the doctor again, saying it was the first time he had spoken to a civilized being in 1,000 years, so he thanks him for listening to his story. The doctor tells him that he had shared a truly valuable story, so they should be the ones thanking him. Then he leaves the room. As he's walking, he thinks that the boy was a very interesting patient, and his story was so vividly detailed that he would have made a great novelist. Then the scene cuts to the awakened central office, and the girl asks if they're sure the information is correct because it doesn't seem right. The guy asks what's wrong with it. The girl explains that the card says he's an F rank. The man clarifies that he was a rare F rank patient, and it was a shame because if he had been E rank, he would have qualified for a government disability benefit. The girl, looking at the protagonist card, says that if he's an F rank, that means he's just an ordinary person, wondering how he managed to pass through a portal and if it wasn't some kind of mistake. The guy responds that he was just lucky and slipped through, and by sheer chance found the return stone, mentioning that he had just received the doctor's report and asking if she wants to read it. So the girl starts going through the information, since it was a common disorder among F rank returnees. On top of that, he had been behaving as if he were a wolf. Remembering the protagonist's expression, the girl wonders if it was just her imagination, asking if that was the file for the returnee named Park. The man confirms it was, saying that even though he was an F rank, they still needed to treat a returnee with proper care, so the girl asks to deliver it to him personally. However, the man wants to know why. She responds that she needed to see for herself. 2 weeks had passed since he returned to Earth after spending 1,000 years in another world. He wanted to go back any moment now, but ever since returning, everything felt very strange. For that reason, he didn't know how he was supposed to live from that day forward. Shortly after, a girl appears, saying it's time for his meal. She then hands him his food, and the boy was apparently starving, so he should eat right away. Soon after, the other girl shows up, watching the protagonist eat in a strange way. Then Park notices the girl beside him. It's revealed that her name is Choi, and she's from the awakened central office. Standing up, Park says her scent is that of a blonde person. For that reason, it seems very familiar. Choi responds that she was the first person he met when he returned, thinking that he definitely resembled a predator when he came out of the portal. However, maybe there was something off with his sensory ability. Finishing his meals, Park says it was very tasty and asks what the awakened central office is about. Then the girl asks why he's speaking so informally to her. Park replies that he's over 1,000 years old, and the girl doesn't seem to believe him, explaining that the Awakened Central Office is an organization designed to help returnees adjust to society. So those were the pieces of information that returnees needed to know. He could take as much time as he needed to read them. For now, he just needed to sign and agree to share his info. Shortly after, Park picks up the pen, saying it had been a long time since he had seen that object. Even after 1,000 years since he returned, they were still using that kind of tool. Then Park signs the paper. Observing the protagonist, Choi wonders if he's nothing more than an idiot. Right after, she calls the boy again. He asks what she wants. Choi asks if he learned how to draw in that place. The protagonist replies that he already knew how to draw before. Choi asks if he learned anything different, like magic or martial arts. Park replies no, since he lived in a forest. To survive, he had to do all kinds of things. The girl then comments that in order to survive, he spent 10 years running around everywhere, and that to become a true returnee capable of crossing portals, you have to kill monsters and absorb their dimensional energy. However, she mentions that despite surviving in such a dangerous dimension, he only managed to cross the portal and find the return stone by pure luck. Park responds that he wasn't there for 10 years, but 1,000. Choi, irritated, says it wasn't 1,000 years, only 10, and that he was mistaken. Choi asks him to check his info, which shows he disappeared in 2015 and returned in 2025 through a portal. Looking at the data, the boy is shocked to realize it was true. The girl then hands him his awakened identification again. As she walks away, Choi mentions that part of his expenses would be deducted due to the damage he caused, and that he should ask about it. She also recommends that once he's recovered, he should go straight back to his family. Then Choi says goodbye and leaves. Park, for his part, is left deep in thought about her words. He wonders if his family is still alive. In the past, he had given up on everything, assuming that even if he made it back to Earth, his friends and family would already be long dead. Now that he had returned, he had to deal with the fact that he had lost the Forest family that had been with him for 1,000 years. However, that was only an assumption since only 10 years had passed. Upon examining the documents, Park is shocked. He learns that his parents had indeed died on that day. However, not all was lost since Juno, his younger brother, was still alive. Desperate, Park rushes to leave the hospital and runs back to the doctor. The doctor asks if there's a problem, and Park replies that he needs his help because his brother is still alive, and he wants to know if the doctor could help find him. The doctor, hesitant, says he doesn't think Park is ready to return to society and would need to assess the situation first. Park, impatient, responds that the doctor hadn't grasped the seriousness of the situation, as he wasn't there to ask for permission. At that moment, the doctor makes a gesture indicating something. He mentions there was one condition. Shortly after, the boy is already in a car, thanking the doctor and promising not to forget the favor. The doctor responds that they'll stay in touch. Before leaving, he asks the driver to make sure Park arrives safely, since he still wasn't fully recovered. As the car drives off, the girl comments that the doctor covered all of Park's hospital expenses, as well as provided clothes and even the driver. She asks why he did all that for Park, considering F-rank returnees are usually neglected by the central office. The doctor replies that he wanted to keep hearing that man's story, and besides, he needed to get the doorknob fixed as soon as possible. The girl, surprised, recalls how the doorknob was damaged, remembering the moment Park yanked the door open in a hurry. Later, the doctor is in his office reflecting that this was the second time the doorknob had been broken. He comments that it had been a long time since he had smelled an irregular. Meanwhile, Park is still in the taxi. A news report comes on saying that at 3:05 p.m. that day, monsters had escaped an unprotected field in the province. The error happened due to a miscalculation in the breaking little portal. Monsters were surrounding the area. The situation was expected to be resolved within roughly 50 minutes. 2 attacks had been neutralized, but 12 awakened soldiers had died. As he listens to the news, Park watches closely. A flashback of the doctor appears, mentioning that the world had changed drastically, becoming a completely different place after the Great Disaster. The doctor comments that if he were awakened, he would have quit his mediocre job and gotten rich by hunting in the fields. The protagonist asks what that was. The man responds that Park must have hit his head pretty hard if he doesn't even know that. Park then asks him to just explain it already. 10 years ago, a door opened to the entire world. That's why that day is called the Great Disaster. It was the first dimensional convergence of their world, which connected with several others and was invaded by monsters. On that day, 10% of the world's population was wiped out. The military at the time wasn't enough to stop the monsters appearing everywhere. So, in regions where military strength was weak, mercenaries were sent in. People who disappeared during the disaster, the so-called awakened, received mercenary licenses and permission to hunt monsters. Park then asks how he could become a mercenary. The man bursts out laughing, saying it's difficult for an ordinary person because first you need to awaken. After that, you just need to pass the mercenary test at the Awakened Central Office. The boy comments that it sounds pretty complicated. Time passes, and the boy appears to be heading somewhere. The driver informs him that they've arrived. He asks if Park can see the house in front of them, since that was the address provided. Shortly after, the protagonist steps out of the car, thanking him for everything. Meanwhile, the young man walks towards the house. An elderly woman looks down at him from above and asks who he is. He responds that he's there for Juno. The woman stays silent and comments that he still wears diapers but talks like he's an adult. Park, however, doesn't understand what she means. She responds that no one by that name lives there and tells him to leave. The boy wonders if he had come to the wrong place. However, inside the house, he hears some people arguing. Shortly after, he approaches the door. He picks up a piece of paper nearby and wonders if his brother is in debt. Sometime later, the boy is walking down the street, thinking that in the jungle, the law of the strongest reigns. But in civilized society, money is the real power. The scene then cuts to a building. Park walks in and presents his awakened card. The woman informs him that his application for the mercenary test was denied because he didn't meet the requirements. Park asks what's wrong since he's an F rank awakened. The woman explains that he was classified as F rank 4 points below the necessary threshold. The boy asks how that's even possible since he had crossed a portal 2 weeks earlier. The woman explains that ordinary people die when they try to cross a portal, with their bodies splitting in half. She continues, saying she doesn't believe he actually did it. Either way, he could attend the Awakened School or earn points in field battles and come back when he became a true Awakened. Leaving the place, Park thinks the system is incredibly confusing. However, he becomes curious about the Goblin Field in Suwon. The scene cuts to another location inside a taxi. Park asks how far those walls stretch. The driver replies that they surround the entire city and that he can see it on the map app. He asks if Park has the app downloaded since the city is divided into 12 areas with hundreds of gates for transit between them. Park, observing the situation, decides he needs it immediately. Shortly after, he spots his destination, and the taxi tells him they've arrived at Suwon Field, Gate 27. The boy steps out of the car and finds himself facing a massive area. He figures that crossing that gate would lead to a hunting ground. Shortly after, he starts walking toward it. 2 soldiers stand motionless at the sight. They ask what the protagonist is doing there. He replies that he's there to hunt. One of the soldiers stays silent and asks to see his mercenary license. However, Park responds that he doesn't have one. The soldier says civilians without licenses are forbidden from entering that area. They then notice something nearby. The other soldier orders them to close the exit, but it's too late. A car comes barreling through the scene. Inside the car, a creature is devouring a man. As a result, the car crashes into a wall. Meanwhile, the other soldier calls the emergency squad to contain the creature. The soldiers surround the vehicle and take combat positions. The creature climbs out of the car. The soldiers give the order to fire and unload on the monster multiple times. The creature appears to be defeated. The soldiers report that the situation has been resolved and that a monster that crossed the gate has been killed. The other soldier wonders where Park went. He wonders if Park had left the area. He probably ran away after seeing the monster. However, that wasn't the case. Meanwhile, the protagonist is walking outside the area, mentioning that even though it was a field, he could still feel everything. On top of that, he'd have to buy himself a car. The boy looks around wondering if, aside from the city of Seoul, all the other cities had been completely destroyed. For that reason, he couldn't believe it. Sometime later, night has fallen. Park mentions that the darkness feels very familiar. He starts walking among the ruins, saying it's time to hunt. Shortly after, he drops to the ground, assuming his body felt a little heavy. Meanwhile, he scans the buildings. Then, he starts sprinting toward them. He successfully scales them, reaching the top. At the top of a building, Park stood tall with the moon behind him, creating a scene that was nothing short of cinematic, but he wasn't there just to look cool. The protagonist closed his eyes and focused, activating his senses to determine the best direction to head. He quickly turned his head to one side and decided to start there. He descended the building effortlessly. The grip on those shoes must be from another planet. Wandering through the empty streets, he approached a dark alley that looked suspicious. At the far end, a pack of goblins had cornered a defenseless dog, ready to make it their dinner. The drool dripping from the monsters' mouths left no doubt they were starving. But that dog wasn't going down easy. It fought back with everything it had. That's when, stepping out from the shadows, our boy appeared. He looked at the dog and, in a slightly ironic tone, asked if it wanted some help. Maybe the desperate look in its eyes said yes. But it didn't matter. The goblins had already made their choice. They charged at the human. Perfect! Park grinned and ran straight into the fight. In the blink of an eye, he spun around and struck from behind. The first goblin took a punch so brutal that its head literally caved into its own body, just like that. But then something even weirder happened. A bunch of system windows started popping up in front of him. Error messages appeared one after another, and our protagonist had no idea what was going on. The screen seemed to be saying something went wrong while recognizing his actions. While he was trying to make sense of it all, the other goblins took the opportunity and attacked. They were brimming with confidence, which got completely shattered when, one by one, they got their teeth knocked out with a single punch each. Total knockout. The last goblin, after watching the massacre of his buddies, tried to escape. In a panic, he climbed up the building, but he made a fatal mistake. He stopped at the top and looked back like he wanted to see the monster he had just faced, and he saw it. Park caught up to him, tossed him off the edge, and the fall ended his life. Back on the ground, another system window popped up, warning of an error in trying to display his class abilities. That triggered a memory from about 100 years ago when he was butt naked and running through a forest trying to survive. That's when he first started earning status points. Could it be that even here on Earth, these system windows still worked? And more importantly, did the errors have anything to do with his body being weaker ever since he returned to this world? Suddenly, a new window appeared titled Achievement Shop. Curious, Park decided to check it out. He had 7 points available and a few item options to buy. Nothing too flashy, but he picked a few, and like magic, the items appeared right in front of him. Before he could even taste the food, a sound caught his attention. It was the same dog from before, but this time it wasn't alone. A puppy stood right beside it. Park approached slowly, placed his hand on the dog's body, and realized it was dying. The animal, trusting its instincts, felt it could finally rest. But Park wasn't ready to let go that easily. In silence, the dog seemed to plead, "Take care of my pup." How could he forget? In the other world, wolves had been his family. Maybe fate was repeating itself. He pulled a snack from his pocket and offered it to the dog. Maybe it was even hungrier than Park himself. After that, he stood up and walked over to the goblin corpses scattered on the ground, 7 in total. It was still night, but it wasn't until sunrise that he finished what he had started. He made a simple grave for the dog that had died protecting its pup, and he stayed there in silence, honoring that moment. Meanwhile, at the entrance of Area 27, traffic was chaos, honking horns, stressed drivers trying to push through. But all that noise stopped when a figure approached, carrying several dead goblins on his back. Even though they were lifeless, the sight of those monsters made the crowd step back. The protagonist sold the bodies and got over 10 for the haul. The most valuable item, the crystals inside each monster, that's the real prize. Since he didn't have a bank account in his name, the payment came entirely in cash. Surprised by the amount, he started to wonder how much more he could earn if he began dungeon crawling and collecting more crystals. Elsewhere in the city, we see a truck parked near a convenience store. Inside, a man was chatting with an old friend while buying a chocolate bar for his kid. Back at the truck, the man looked cheerful. It had been a calm work day, and now all he wanted was to head home. But the peaceful vibe didn't last long. On his way back, someone suddenly called out his name, Park Junho, and without warning, he took a brutal punch that sent him straight to the ground, saying that it had been a long time and that they were worried because he had said he would abandon his child and run away. The man looks up and seems to recognize that person. Then the others start beating on Juno, Park's brother, saying he looked better than the last time they saw him, asking how many times he thought they had come there. Shortly after, Juno pulls out some money and mentions that this was the payment he had received. Counting the bills, the man says the monthly fee was 8,000 Brazilian reais, and the accumulated interest was over 6,000 Brazilian reais, so there was still money missing. With tears in his eyes, Juno apologizes, saying if he couldn't get the money, they should wait 3 days. Hitting him again, the man asks how much he thought 3 days of interest were worth, telling him to stop lying. At that moment, someone calls out for Juno. The other man asks who that person was. Juno is stunned to realize that his brother is still alive. Shortly after, Park walks up to his brother and asks if he is Juno. Then a flashback shows Juno being bullied by other people. Right after, the protagonist is seen watching the situation. Juno begs his brother for help. However, Park seemed to completely ignore it, leaving Juno alone in that situation and just walking away. So his brother had never really been much help in his life. The flashback shows news of mysterious explosions spreading across the country. Additionally, red spheres, which were portals, start appearing along with the explosions. Juno, watching all of this, is shocked. He runs toward his mother's room. His parents are happy because he was home. However, they still didn't know the whereabouts of the other brother. At that moment, an explosion goes off and several monsters begin to appear. Meanwhile, a giant eye is watching Juno. Shortly after, he disappears. Returning to the present, Park looks pleased, mentioning that Juno had grown since the last time he saw him. Juno responds that he thought Park was dead. Right after, the other guy interrupts the moment. He asks if that man was really Juno's older brother. At that moment, Park grabs the boy's head. In seconds, the boy is thrown back. Juno watches in shock. The protagonist threw the guy so hard that he went flying to the side. The 2 henchmen are stunned by what they just saw. Park asks if his brother is hurt. He replies that he's fine. At that moment, the other guy charges at Park. Park attempts to kick him. However, it seemed to have no effect. The man's leg simply broke. Falling to the ground, the guy starts writhing in pain. The other guy is still trembling in fear. He assumes that the protagonist is an awakened being. Shortly after, Park tells the man to come at him. However, the man responds that he hadn't hurt him. He says Park has to believe him. He told those people to leave him alone. Shortly after, Park hands some money to the man. He tells him to take the money and leave. Sometime later, night has fallen. That elderly woman appears in front of her. The protagonist and his brother watch. The woman asks if he was sure that man was his brother. Juno responds that he's sure. Park, calling the woman grandma, mentions that he brought some meat. The woman says they should keep in contact since they're family. She tells them to hurry up because the boy had fallen asleep waiting for his father to come home. Inside the house, a boy seems to be sleeping. Park asks Juno if that was his son. Juno responds that his name is Gungo and that he's his only treasure. Park asks where the boy's mother was. Juno replies that she had left to live her own life, but it was his fault for not providing enough for his family. Park, trying to lift the mood, says they should have a drink. Later, they're at the table drinking. Juno responds that after Park disappeared, he thought he was dead all this time. But here he was alive without even having aged. Park asks how much money he owed. Juno responds that it was around 220,000 Brazilian reais. But it's okay because he's sure he'll manage to handle his debts. He says he has a job now. The protagonist asks what kind of job he has. Juno responds that he works at a logistics center. Park asks if the truck was his. Juno replies that it wasn't and that it used to belong to his grandmother's son. However, he had rented it from her. Once again, the protagonist asks what his grandmother's son used to do. Then, Juno responds that he had heard Park had died during the Great Disaster. Shortly after, the boy wakes up, realizing there was a dog in front of him. Looking to the side, he finds his father. Juno, happy, asks if his son had already woken up. Embarrassed, the boy asks who that man was. His father replies that it was his uncle and asks him to greet him. A while later, the boy is seen playing with the dog. Juno thinks it's nice to see that. The boy had always wanted a dog. Park suggests that the two of them should work together. However, Juno seems confused by this. Park responds that he'll do all the work. He just asks for help with the truck. Juno, on the other hand, asks what he was planning to do. Park replies that he wants to hunt some monsters. This leaves Juno completely shocked by what he just heard. Sometime later, the scene cuts to the command center. The girl is congratulating the protagonist. The protagonist registers as an awakened being. Somehow he had managed to increase his stats in just one day. Park asks if he's now an F-rank druid. The girl responds that now he could use his identification to open a bank account. She says he could carry out financial transactions, handing something to him. She mentions it was a small gift for registering as an awakened being. Also, he shouldn't forget to download the Awakened Central app. She tells him to gather enough dimensional energy to become a ranker. He should be eligible for pensions and many other benefits. She asks if the protagonist knew how to open a status window. Due to recent technical issues, the interface had undergone changes. At that moment, Park says the keyword. The system screen appears showing all his stats. Observing this, Park wonders why his stats were so low. Then the scene cuts to the truck belonging to Park's brother. He's happy because his brother managed to get a phone. He congratulates him on officially becoming an awakened being. In the middle of the call, he says he's on his way, so he'll meet his brother Zer as soon as he delivers the last batch. Now that Park has become an awakened being on paper, all that remains is the mercenary test. However, Park replies that before they do that, they should pay off his debt. Juno responds that he's still an F rank, so he doesn't think they're ready to hunt monsters yet. However, the protagonist hangs up on him. Juno wonders if this was really his brother. It seemed like he had completely changed. As he walks toward the location, the protagonist says the gate seems to be closed. Meanwhile, on Route 77, a group of people seems to be in a rush because they're going to miss their game. Inside the car, a group of people seems nervous. However, the other guy tells them to relax. He asks why they're scared since they're awakened after all. He questions if they had forgotten they could officially become raiders in the guild because if they succeeded, they'd be able to clear that dungeon. Annoyed, the other guy thinks these people are really incompetent. They were doing it for the money and wouldn't have come this far without their connections. Shortly after, the soldier calls for the next person. So the man is surprised and the protagonist appears again at that place. The soldier asks if he's alone. Park responds that he is. Shortly after, Park places his card on the reader. The soldier starts pulling up some data on the protagonist. He asks if Park knew that was a ranking with limits, so he couldn't enter just any dungeon. Meanwhile, the man from before is watching the protagonist, who's entering that place completely alone. The other soldier asks if he thought the protagonist would be okay. After all, he didn't even have proper equipment. However, the other guy tells him not to worry because that was the guy who single-handedly took out 7 goblins at gate 27. The other guy in the car, apparently jealous of the protagonist, wonders who he thought he was, wondering if he was going into the field like that. For that reason, he thought Park was crazy. The other soldier then apologizes for the delay, saying he was having some technical issues. Finishing the verification, the guy tells his friend to speed up because they're going to follow the protagonist route. However, he becomes confused because the boy had simply disappeared in the middle of that tunnel. The other guy wonders where Park had gone, and the man thinks he might have stumbled onto something very interesting. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to the forest and Park seems to be running through the place. Shortly after, he stops, saying this must be the current state of his body. So it seemed like Park had become very weak. He needed to motivate himself to improve and start training again. Looking at something, he seemed surprised. He was hearing strange voices, and he guessed it could be the sound of a sword battle. A little further ahead, the boy noticed something and assumed the sound was coming from that direction. Shortly after, the young man smiled, thinking that a fight between civilized beings rather than beasts could be a great opportunity. For that reason, he couldn't afford to miss it. The scene then cuts to someone losing their arm. Above that battle, the protagonist coldly observes, and amid the commotion, a group of people is being surrounded. Park, irritated, says it seems like it would take all day for them to start killing. Meanwhile, a man steps out of a car. He asks why it's taking so long to deal with those people. The soldier observing the man looks surprised. Then, irritated, the man tells them to deal with it at once. Another man says that person had a bounty of 200,000 Brazilian reais on his head. Meanwhile, the protagonist is listening to what the man is saying, surprised by the amount he could receive if he killed that person. The soldier watching that man seemed astonished. So the group seemed ready to finish off those people. The man then confirms that his bounty is indeed that amount, so they should try to catch him if they could. However, the group didn't seem very confident, wondering if even giving their all, they'd be able to win. At that moment, the man charges at the people. Within seconds, the protagonist appears, heading toward the other soldiers. The man watching Park becomes confused, and the other soldier wonders who that man was. He then begins walking toward the other soldier. The guy asks who he is. Park, on the other hand, asks if he really said the bounty on his head was that high. The man, confirming it, asks who the boy was, and Park responds that he was just someone who needed a lot of money. The man's subordinates wonder who this boy could be. Shortly after, the man starts laughing at the protagonist, saying it seemed he wasn't part of the central office, so it would have been better for him to mind his own business. At that moment, the protagonist starts to feel something strange, wondering what was happening to his body. The man explains that Park had looked into his eyes for more than 5 seconds, which meant he would no longer be able to move. Shortly after, the man gives an order for his soldiers to charge at Park, and they point their swords at the boy. However, the protagonist is able to move again, leaving everyone completely shocked by what just happened. With a smile on his face, Park asks if that was magic, saying it was very interesting. Then the man uses his binding ability again, immobilizing the protagonist once more. Park says it was expected because he wasn't a small fry. He then draws his dagger, saying the man should have thought twice before messing with him. But at that moment, Park strikes the man who seems to have been injured by the attack. Park asks if he had any other tricks up his sleeve. He then punches the man, and a flurry of punches follows. The man is thrown back where he appears to have been defeated. Park, for his part, says that was all very boring. The other guy thinks that to deal with that man so easily, Park must be incredibly strong, and he wonders who the protagonist really was. Meanwhile, the group of soldiers keeps watching the boy. Park asks if they still wanted to fight. The group responds that they didn't. Shortly after, the protagonist points to a place, telling them to go there, and asks if anyone happened to have a rope. One of the men responds that he had one. The protagonist then asks what was there. However, the group responds that they didn't have a bounty because they had no choice and were forced to work with that man, or they would be killed. So delivering that man would be enough to make him rich. With tears in his eyes, the man couldn't believe his companions had betrayed him, abandoning him after he had helped them all this time. Park, for his part, asks if he had finally woken up. The group starts insulting the man, saying he was just a piece of trash. The boy then asks if he wouldn't get anything for getting rid of those people. Then the other man mentions they were lying since they were all criminals too. Surely, some of them must have bounties. However, the group responded that it wasn't true. They claimed they were really just useless vagabonds. Park, on the other hand, was called by the man asking what the city's laws were that made him feel so unrestricted. Because in that place, right there, the land was true freedom. So, if he let him go, he would do whatever he could to make Park live like a king. But at that moment, the protagonist kicks the man again, telling him to be quiet. The man seemingly passed out. Park then asks if the man was saying that all those people had bounties on their heads. The man answers that since most of them were former criminals. Unhappy, the man thinks this was the end for him. Park asks if there weren't too many to take with them, and the boy says they could leave them behind. The protagonist replies that it was time for everyone to take a nap. Sometime later, the scene cuts to a car driving down the road. Inside, the boy says they really needed his help, so they had to repay him somehow. However, the protagonist replies that they didn't need to do that. The other man then says that thanks to Park, they managed to leave that place alive. Park says that if they wanted to see it that way, they could do something for him. The group then starts asking several questions, like what his special powers and abilities were. The man responds that his awakened ability was swordsmanship, and he learned tracking by studying through skill books. Park, surprised, realizes one could learn magic through books. The man, also surprised, asks if Park really didn't know what a skill book was. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks it would be better to learn 1 or 2 combat magic abilities since they could probably be useful in the future. However, something surprises him because before him, a giant light is surrounding the area. He asks if that was a portal. The boy is surprised by the question, saying yes, and mentioning that it was a level 1 dungeon, the lowest level, which is why they were planning to go there. Park says it's a pity because he might have been able to go to that place if he at least had a mercenary license. The man, shocked by what he heard, asks if Park really didn't have a license. Park replies that he really didn't have one. When a portal opens, the military first secures the area, and any monsters found in the fields are just small fry that somehow survive the attacks. And the experience one could gain in those low-level fields, where level 1 dungeons are open and rank as E could even allow you to surpass that level. In other words, you should actually be going to level 2 dungeons. The man, still confused, wonders how this rookie, who hadn't even gone to a level 1 dungeon, managed to defeat that cease-ranked. Park, noticing the man staring at him, asks what he wanted. The man apologizes, asking if he could know what Park's rank was. Park then tells him it was F rank, leaving the man completely stunned by what he heard. Park then asks what favor he should request. The scene cuts to the portal from earlier. From it, a person seems to be emerging. The man from before is at the area. His group looks somewhat injured after entering the portal. As a result of everything that happened during the battle, another boy had lost his hand. For that reason, they urgently needed a doctor. The man, irritated, wonders if mercenary licenses are being handed out to anyone these days. The first thing he's going to do when he gets back to the guild is kick the person who picked those fools. However, the other boy asks him to calm down, saying he shouldn't be so hard on the rookie since he knows the guild's condition these days. Even knowing all that, the man is still very frustrated. He thinks people with rich parents can easily enter that place and become awakened, and after that, their parents hire mercenaries to carry them through the dungeons. Suddenly, they're ready to join the guild and go on missions. However, it's the guild members who suffer for accepting those useless people. The guy, noticing his captain's irritation, asks if they shouldn't cool their heads. That's why they should have a drink. The man then asks how everything is going, since a level 1 dungeon was about to disappear. He asks if anything had happened, and a soldier responds that something big did since someone had just delivered 10 looters to them, and among the captives there was a rank C who he had certainly heard of. The man asks if any high-ranking individual was supposed to visit them at the camps that day. However, the soldier replied no, saying it was a rank F novice who didn't have a mercenary license and managed to capture that man. In disbelief, the man asks how that happened. The soldier answers that he didn't know the details, but according to witnesses, the rank F had simply beaten that man up. The man was then surprised, guessing it might have been the person he had seen earlier in the tunnel. He asked where that rank F had gone. The soldier, in turn, replies that he had seen him heading toward the portals. Quickly, the man heads toward the portals again, thinking he had to witness that boy's ability with his own eyes, and if it was worth it, he might gain something valuable from that story. Soon after, the man ends up getting into a truck. The other guy then asks what the problem was. The man asks if the boy who had captured the man earlier had just entered the portal. Meanwhile, the protagonist, along with his brother, was entering a portal, mentioning that this time it hadn't hurt at all, and the clothes seemed to be doing fine. Juno replied that items without dimensional energy couldn't pass through portals, but as they had just seen, those clothes passed smoothly because they were made from materials found in the dungeons. Looking to the side, Park seemed confused, asking what that thing in front of him was. Juno responded that it was called a door, and the portal they had just entered was one of several doors that gave access to all 38 dungeons. At the same moment, the two were surprised. Park asked why the door had disappeared. Then the man answered that it would reappear once they had finished the dungeon. The protagonist asked if they had to kill all the monsters. The boy responded, no, they only had to kill the strongest one, the boss. Stretching. Our boy replied that he'd finished this quickly. However, Juno asked him to wait, but the protagonist didn't seem to have heard any of that, so he quickly jumped. The man, surprised, wondered who that man was, thinking he might be the guy from the rumors. With that level of power, he could very well break the record time for clearing a level 1 dungeon. However, he soon realized something because they didn't even have tracking abilities, so they wouldn't be able to find the door's location within the time limit. Because of that, if they got stuck there, they might disappear along with the portal. Then, the scene cuts back to the man with the analyzer. The door the protagonist had entered had just closed. This made the man very angry by what he had heard. Then, the scene cuts back to inside the protagonist portal. Some monsters were wandering around that place. However, one of them was suddenly hit by something and thrown back. Park, observing everything, said they were carrying very interesting things, and he began extracting the stone from inside them, mentioning that there was only one blood crystal after killing 3 of them. But still, what was most important at that moment was leveling up. Meanwhile, that guy was watching everything Park had done, wondering how many monsters he had killed. Soon after, the boy ended up using his tracking ability, finding the protagonist's location, and was checking his stats, mentioning that he could buy 2 abilities with 102 achievement points. Then he ended up buying a beast taming ability. At that moment, 2 monsters began charging toward him. Noticing this, he started immobilizing them and easily defeated them. The system notified him that he had earned the achievement. The system notified him again that there was a critical error since a data synchronization conflict was in progress. Park, confused, wondered what that was. Then it was reported that the boy had leveled up to level 2. He was happy because his stats had increased as usual. Because of this, he went on to buy the next Tree Spirit ability with 100 points. Then the system notified him that he had finally acquired the ability. The boy then asked to summon the Tree Spirit. A light began to surround the place and a kind of green spirit started to appear. Park, surprised, thought it was the same one. When he had seen it for the first time in the jungle, he thought it had been some kind of firefly. So he asked the Tree Spirit to search for the missing goblins. Following the protagonist's orders, the spirit left, beginning to search for the missing monsters. Park, said the Tree Spirit, transmitted the memories it read from the vegetation and trees into his mind. However, it was still a bit slow, and he wondered if it was because his level was still low. At that moment, he started to analyze his status window along with his abilities. He then noticed he had 2 abilities, one for searching and the other for tracking. Because of this, he decided to buy both to keep improving. Immediately, he placed his hand on the ground. He began using his searching ability, stating it was a reference point. Then he used his tracking ability, receiving the information that the goblins were already dead. However, he was surprised. Looking to the side, he assumed it wasn't just an ordinary goblin. At that moment, he rushed toward that place, astonished by what he saw. The boy from earlier was being attacked by a different monster. Park, on the other hand, asked what he was doing. Then he smiled, happy that the protagonist had returned. The young man then asked if he hadn't said he would hunt alone. However, the young man replied that he was actually the one being hunted. Then he begged the protagonist for help. Immediately, the protagonist rushed toward the creature, managing to block the attack. Quickly, he recovered his stance. But within seconds, Park struck again, slamming the creature against a rock. As a result, the monster was completely covered in blood. However, there was no time to think since Park was already above him, so he managed to finish the monster, and the system notified him that he had leveled up. He earned 120 achievement points. The young man observing the protagonist was amazed by his skills. Park then assumed the door should have already opened. The young man confirmed he was right. A while later, the two had already left the portal, and that group from before was watching the two of them. One of the men wondered if it was the same guy who had captured the bounty man earlier. He mentioned that Captain Kang had asked to be contacted if the protagonist returned. Looking at some information, the man wondered what the completion time for that dungeon had been. Meanwhile, the boy said he needed to return to his teammates, so he said he would get in touch later. Park in turn confirmed this, saying he would leave all the clothes in the warehouse. The scene then shifted to that location, and Park had already changed his clothes, mentioning that he was really hungry. However, he was surprised. A man had appeared asking if his name was Park. The boy asked who he was. The man introduced himself as Kang, the captain of the 27th combat team of the guild. He asked if he could have a few minutes of his time. Later, the protagonist and that unknown man seemed to be discussing something. Park, meanwhile, asked if he was from the Sheila Guild. The man invited him to join his guild, offering to provide an environment to help him grow. However, the boy responded that he wasn't interested in that. The man, irritated, asked what was wrong with the kid since he was refusing to join a guild without even thinking about it. He said that if he was already associated with a guild, they could make an official offer. However, the boy responded that he wasn't in any guild. The man said that they might be in 4th place. But he needed to know there was practically no difference in strength between the top guilds. However, the boy replied that he didn't like being under other people. Then time passed again. Park was apparently already at home, saying it seemed like they hadn't returned yet. As he lay down, he thought they might be enjoying some quality time together as father and son. Shortly after, the old woman appeared, asking why young people these days like to disrespect time so much. The protagonist then replied that she should sit down too, since the weather was perfect for a nap. However, the woman replied that she was hanging up clothes and didn't have time for that. Seeing his grandmother doing all that by herself, the boy ended up helping her. Then the grandmother asked if he was really Juno's older brother. The protagonist answered that he was. Soon after, the woman commented it was a pleasant surprise since Juno was at their house, but Park responded that wasn't true, it was the opposite. The woman replied that with all those strange monsters appearing out of nowhere and causing havoc, she thought looking younger wasn't something to be surprised about. She said she had heard it had been 10 years since he had seen his brother. Because of that, she wondered if he would take care of himself and not break his family's heart again. Hearing what the woman said, Park smiled. He asked her not to worry, saying he wouldn't die so easily. Soon after, the boy's brother, along with his son, appeared. They greeted the protagonist. Then Park handed a piece of paper to the man, who looked confused and asked what it was. Park explained it was the money he owed and he should use it to sort out his life. He told him to pay his debt quickly so they could have dinner together. Emotional, his brother asked how he could repay such a favor. However, Park told him not to get too sentimental and that he should just go. With tears in his eyes, the man left. Park then called out to his brother again. He asked if he had enough money to buy food and drinks on his way back. The man replied that he did and he would return before they even noticed. Park stayed on the terrace taking care of his nephew. At that moment, a system screen appeared, indicating the target was following him and that he should name it. Park wondered what he should call the dog. The child suggested it should be named Baku. Hearing that name, Park replied it didn't sound too bad. From that moment on, the dog would be called Baku. Time passed. The child lying down said he was really hungry and wondered why his father hadn't arrived yet. Noticing his brother's truck, Park assumed his brother had already arrived, so he decided to go welcome him. Shortly after, the child along with the protagonist headed toward the truck. However, the man appeared covered in blood and collapsed on the ground. Park, seeing this, wondered why it happened. Sometime later, the scene shifted to a building at night. Meanwhile, a group of people inside the building seemed to be playing a card game. One man asked if the fight should start that week. Another man replied yes, saying he'd seen all the online communities were betting on the man named Miho. The man asked if there was any news from Horizon, since last time they went there, they lost a lot of money. At that moment, someone was banging loudly on the door. Irritated, the man asked what the noise was. Then the other men stood up to see what the commotion was. At that moment, the door burst open and the silhouette of a man appeared, completely covered in blood. Immediately, someone grabbed the man's head, dragging him out the door. The men watching the situation wondered why it happened. Then a piercing gaze was directed at the door, and from that point, chaos erupted. The group, shocked, couldn't understand what was happening. Within seconds, a cabinet and a weapon were thrown in their direction. A commotion broke out. Several people were thrown around. The boss, watching it all, was surprised that the protagonist had taken down everyone in a matter of seconds. Another man asked if he knew who that person was. The man replied that he seemed to be awakened. At that moment, the protagonist threw a table at the man. Right after, he climbed on top of it, asking if his name was Kim. Irritated, the man said that was indeed his name, demanding to know who the protagonist was. The boy replied that someone wanted to settle Park Junju's debt. The man said he must be insane. Asking if he called himself awakened after beating up honest, hard-working people, he told him not to think he would get away with it. At that moment, the man received a slap to the face. Park asked what that had to do with it and why he slapped him just because he wanted to pay off his debt. He said, all he should have done with his brother was take the money and leave. He asked why he had crossed the line and done that to his own brother. As he received the slaps, the man begged to be left alone. Park, in turn, asked if he wanted to settle the debt or get beaten until he died. Without even thinking, the man said he would settle everything at once. A while later, the entire group was kneeling before Park, saying that from that moment on, their client, Juno, would no longer have any obligations to them and all his debts would be paid. Park then replied that if they ever saw them again, they should consider themselves dead. He told them to make sure not to cross his path, kneeling. They all confirmed what the boy had said. However, one of the men still didn't seem to have given up. Sometime later, the man mentioned that the protagonist had already left. Irritated, the man, plotting his plans, wondered if the boy really thought he didn't have people backing him. Once again, the scene shifted to a building and that guild leader from earlier mentioned that he had found new talent. He asked to take a look at this person and showed some information about Park. However, the man noted that he was just a rank F, and besides that, he had registered as an awakened only that day. The other man said that was all the more reason to be interested, since they could take a closer look at his profile, but the system notified that access had been denied. They wondered what kind of person he was. However, they managed to bypass the security and access the information. They still wanted to know why his profile was confidential. It seemed he hadn't joined the guild yet, and there appeared to be more to his story. Then, the man asked to check his abilities. The boy mentioned he was a type of conjurer. Moreover, he had previously defeated a man with a high bounty very easily. He asked if they knew this man had been missing for 10 years, which made the situation strange. They wondered if he might be a special agent. The man then said he thought he'd be strong because of his abilities and never considered he might be a member of an intelligence service. The boy then said they should give up on recruiting this person because he was 100% certain he belonged to another country. He mentioned he knew this would happen the moment there was all that fuss. Wanting to change the subject, the other man suggested they go have coffee. He asked why a special agent would have entered a level 1 dungeon. The boy asked why it mattered so much. Again, the man asked him to keep an eye on the protagonist, but the boy seemed reluctant to do so. The scene then shifted to a hospital. The protagonist was visiting his brother, asking if he was awake yet. Juno then noticed his brother had arrived, asking why he had bought so much food. Park replied that he had heard he ate a lot and it helped with recovery. Park, in turn, asked if he was feeling better. Juno responded he would be able to remove his bandages the next day. He then asked if his mercenary test was tomorrow. The boy replied that it was. Juno said it would be great if he could pass the test and be invited to a guild. However, the protagonist didn't seem to want that. He thought to himself that he had once been the king of the forest. For that reason, he couldn't join a group and become someone's lackey. Juno then said he should look into some high-ranking guilds for him to join. The boy replied there was no need because he would create his own guild. In disbelief, Juno asked if he was really going to create a guild instead of joining one. Sometime later, the scene shifted to the adventurer's agency. Meanwhile, Choi seemed to be walking through the building. Shortly after, an older man called out to her. He asked what had happened to her in recent days. He mentioned there had been 2 breaches in her area, and if yesterday's portal had been a bridge portal, the city would have been in ruins by now. The girl then asked if they couldn't do anything without her. However, the man asked her to help because the portal department manager had been bothering him all day. What he was trying to say was that she was wasting her talent, but the girl replied it had been hard to stay focused lately. Handing her a paper, the man told her to stop talking nonsense and read it at once. In turn, she was surprised because they had sent her to do manual labor when she thought she was finally going to get a break. But the man replied she wasn't the only one, and it wasn't the first time anyway. Right after, the girl, irritated, began to leave the place. The man asked her not to go around rejecting candidates just because she was upset. He reminded her they were short on people and needed every person they could get. She replied, it was better to reject those idiots who couldn't protect themselves. Shortly after, the scene shifted to another location. A group of people was discussing how they needed to pass that test. Meanwhile, a man appeared doing a live stream on YouTube. Everyone in that place was eager to take the test to get their mercenary license. Soon after, a different group of people entered the area. The man noted they would have to end the stream because the test was about to begin. At that moment, the protagonist appeared, staring at the boy. The boy then asked if it was the first time Park was watching the live stream. Park asked who he was talking to. As the boy requested some space, soon after, the supervisor introduced himself, saying he'd be in charge of everything for the next 3 days. The 21 supervisors present that day would evaluate whether they had what it took to pass the test. He'd assumed that everyone had received a ticket with their number upon arrival. They would begin the selection of supervisors through a random draw. So when their name was called, they were to form a single line in front of their supervisor. Time passed, and many people were called until it was the protagonist's turn, who received number 15. However, he was surprised by something. His supervisor would be that blonde girl from before. Observing her, he mentioned it had been a long time since he had seen her. The boy recognized her immediately, and the man asked them to head to their respective waiting rooms and rest until further announcements were made. Meanwhile, the boy who had been streaming earlier was heading to the location, bragging to his viewers it would be tough to pass the test. However, he seemed like he would leave the next day. It was then revealed that the streamer from earlier was also in the room where the protagonist was. Looking to the side, he noticed the boy, asking why he looked so sad when he had been so excited earlier. Looking at the protagonist, he realized it was the same guy from before, asking if he ever heard about that blonde girl's craziness, because there was a reason everyone called her a witch. That girl was the type to eliminate someone just because she was having a bad day. Park, in turn, asked why it was the supervisor's fault, and not the fault of those who weren't prepared. Irritated, the boy thought Park had just ignored his words, knowing from the start he was useless, asking if he cared to show respect to his seniors. However, the protagonist replied that if he had a problem, he should solve it like real men with a fight. The boy then asked if he thought he was easy prey. Quickly, Park responded that he did. Irritated, the boy said he was going crazy and told Park to follow him. Meanwhile, Choi had arrived at the location. However, she noticed no one was there. Annoyed, she wondered where everyone had gone. The scene then cut to a ring arena, and the protagonist, along with the boy, was preparing for a fight. The boy said Park was very unlucky because he should have fought twice before wanting to fight him, asking if he had never heard of TV Kaboo, since despite appearances, he was a promising YouTuber. Park seemed unaware of what that was, asking if it was some kind of food. This made the boy even more irritated, and he mentioned he would have to teach Park a lesson. Everyone in the stands was excited about the fight, fully cheering for the streamer, saying one of his hobbies was teaching manners to disrespectful kids like Park. Watching all of this, the protagonist remarked, everything seemed quite fun. The streamer then warned Park not to ask him to cover his hospital expenses after he was done with him. At that moment, he charged at the protagonist, throwing a punch. However, Choi appeared on the scene, ordering everyone to return to the waiting room immediately. As a result, the group hurriedly left. Watching the protagonist and the man, Choi asked if they were desperate to fail the test, and she didn't need an explanation. One of them just had to take the blame. Whoever lost would fail the test and they should continue the fight. The streamer, watching this, thought it was expected because that woman was crazy. Then Park prepared for the battle. The streamer asked him not to be nervous, reminding him it was the protagonist who had asked for this. Park, in turn, apologized for what was about to happen. At that moment, the boy charged at Park, but within seconds, he was struck by a punch and was quickly knocked out. Choi, watching this, was surprised, thinking ever since the day she met him, she had felt an uncomfortable sensation that wouldn't go away. Park, looking at Choi, asked why she seemed so distracted, saying if she wanted a fight too, she should get into the ring. However, he had one condition. If he won, she couldn't disqualify the other guy. Choi in turn said the boy must be crazy. Then she entered the ring, asking if the young man was perhaps an irregular. However, Park didn't know what that meant and asked what it was. Then the girl lunges at the protagonist, who manages to dodge the attack. Choi then starts attacking the young man repeatedly. He seemed to only be on the defensive. Just as she was about to attack again, Choi says if he wins, she would grant him that request. However, she ends up landing a fatal blow on him, thinking something was wrong because he was definitely hiding something. Shortly after, she is surprised, and the protagonist responds that she was stronger than he had thought. The girl is then surprised that Park was able to withstand her attack. At that moment, she charges at him again, saying this time it was really over. She lands another attack on the boy, following up with a series of attacks on him. However, out of nowhere, he seems to start fighting back. He lands a punch on the girl, even managing to break her shield. However, it still wasn't enough. But even so, she was surprised Park was able to break her shield. Shortly after, the boy charges at her again, declaring this was a lot of fun. Choi, for her part, says he really wasn't irregular. Park, still confused, asks what that meant. Then the girl responds that she surrenders. The protagonist, confused, asks why since the fight was just getting good. The girl replies the place was too small to use her abilities, and that they should fight in a larger area next time. Park, on his part, asks if there were strong girls like her on Earth, to which Choi responds there weren't many. Shortly after, the protagonist says he chooses her and for that reason they should make babies, asking if she wanted to mate with him. However, the girl slaps him across the face. Meanwhile, that streamer finally wakes up wondering what had happened. At the same time, Choi was very irritated by that and starts walking away. That guy was still surprised since he had been knocked out with just one punch. For that reason, he should go home since he wasted money on the application without even taking the test, mentioning that it was very embarrassing. Looking at the protagonist, the young man still seemed angry, asking if he was satisfied with that. However, Park responds that he hadn't been disqualified. Meanwhile, the camera was watching them, and the scene cuts to an old man looking at a computer, completely shocked that Choi had lost. Park then calls the streamer to leave together. However, he was still confused, asking why he hadn't been disqualified. Park informs him he had asked Choi to ignore his disqualification. The streamer still wanted to know why the protagonist got slapped, but the boy responds that he didn't need to know that. Shortly after, the young man seems to have realized something, supposing he had been hit because of him. That's why he convinced the girl to ignore the commotion by letting her hit him. Realizing that, shortly after, the guy starts to follow Park. At that moment, someone on the intercom calls Park, asking him to go to the supervisor's office as soon as possible. A while later, our protagonist is in the supervisor's office discussing with him, asking why he had called him. The man then says that before they talk, he should know everything was being recorded and that he had seen his fight with Supervisor Choi. And for that reason, he was surprised that a candidate like him managed to go up against a rank B awakened, asking if the boy was by chance an awakened. However, Park still didn't know what that was, mentioning they had already asked that question twice. The man, observing the situation, supposes Park needed more information about the portals. The pit portals connect Earth to 3 other planets. The first was called Aruka, which was the home planet of elves and dwarves. Additionally, that planet had relations with Earth, and from time to time they made exchanges, and the humans who returned from there learned skills related to magic and artifact creation. The next planet was called Kachan, inhabited by Momonas and martial artists, who were constantly fighting for their planet's sovereignty. Those martial artists were their allies, while the Momonas were their enemies. And the last planet was called Meter, a place dominated by orcs. And to make matters worse, that planet was also infested with ferocious monsters. Among the Earthlings who returned from those 3 planets, there are those who learned extremely powerful abilities, and they discovered their combat power exceeded that of the Awakened. That's why they decided to classify them as irregulars. Hearing the whole story, Park said it was too complicated, but he was sure the place where he had been wasn't any of those 3 planets. The supervisor, on his part, is confused by what he heard, wondering if by chance he was a dungeon returnee, questioning which planet the boy had returned from. Park says he had already told the previous doctor that he had lived with wolves for over 1,000 years. A while later, the protagonist had finished telling his story. The supervisor then thanks him for sharing so he could return to his waiting room. Shortly after, the protagonist leaves the room. However, the supervisor says the story was too absurd to be true. At that moment, a man appears in the room introducing himself, saying he heard he had been called. Then the boss asks if he could take over as the supervisor of room 15. The man asks if that wasn't the area Captain Choi was in charge of, confirming it was. The man informs him she had fled, but the details didn't matter, and he wanted him to monitor candidate Park and then provide a detailed report on him when his test was over. Meanwhile, the protagonist was already in that room with all the candidates waiting for the test to begin. Shortly after, everyone alongside their captains was lined up, and that man from earlier really took over as the supervisor of room 15. The streamer observing this asks if Choi had been fired by chance, then enters Suzy. Then the man introduces himself, saying his name was Sang and that he was in charge of supervising Team 15. The minimum requirement for that day's physical test was 9 seconds in a 100-meter dash and an hour to complete the triangle. Shortly after, the test had already begun and several people were being disqualified quickly. The girl then says that for a healer, there should be an easier test. Sang asks if she thought the monsters would go easy on her just because she was a healer, so the man calls the next candidate. Han is then introduced, saying 9 seconds was too easy, saying he would see the protagonist in the next round. Then, Sang gives the signal and Han starts running. The supervisor says it took a total of 8 seconds, so he passed the test. Then the next candidate is called, and the protagonist is preparing. Meanwhile, Han is cheering for the boy, and when the race starts, Park begins running in a matter of seconds. Everyone around is completely astonished by what they had seen. Shortly after, the director receives a call from someone saying it was Sergeant Kim, mentioning the result of candidate Park Suho's physical test had just come out and was quite surprising. Back at the test, there were some reporters taking pictures and recording Park because he was quite impressive. At the same time, another person receives a call, and the girl says she's Miso from the association and the director of the returnee center. The supervisor on the call says he'll send some videos of Park, and for that reason, she needed to watch them. Watching those videos, the girl seemed surprised. The other guy mentions Major Young had the ability to detect lies, so they could say the protagonist had told the truth in that interview. Miso, on the other hand, still didn't believe the doctor's report was true. To that extent, the boy was probably an irregular, so he had to be at least stronger than a rank B. For that reason, if his story was true, it meant Park Suho might be a returnee from a fourth planet. Shortly after, Miso asks him to make sure no reporters appear at the training grounds again. However, that guy seems surprised, mentioning it was already too late because the protagonist had already appeared in the news. At that moment, Miso asks to remove all those articles immediately. Then the scene cuts to several photographers taking some pictures of someone. Meanwhile, the protagonist alongside Han was walking down the street. Miso, for her part, thinks it meant Park somehow managed to maintain his physical status despite passing through a portal without protective equipment, wondering if by chance he was given an F ranking due to his lack of dimensional energy. In any case, if he really had returned from a fourth planet, South Korea might gain an advantage regarding the development of the unknown fourth planet. Meanwhile, several reporters were trying to enter a certain location. Above there, many participants from the test were eating. Meanwhile, Park along with Han was eating as well. Han, surprised, thinks not just anyone could knock him out on the first try. Noticing Han staring at him, Park asks us what's wrong and if he had finished eating already. Han responds it was nothing, asking if the boy was thirsty as he would get water for him. Thinking that just by watching the protagonist eat, one could tell he was on a completely different level. For that reason, he was sure Park would be a big deal in the future. Shortly after, time passes and Park seems to be about to sleep. Han says that seeing how those lockers were empty, he imagined the rest of the people had failed the test. For that reason, they were going to be in a lot of trouble. Park asks why he thought that. The guy responds the next part of the test involved incursions in dungeons, so teams with more members had an easier time, while those with fewer struggled. However, Park tells him not to worry about that since they didn't need more people. Hearing what the boy said, Han is surprised, thinking he was very good. However, the situation was different since dungeons had many unpredictable factors, so he thought it would be easier to have more people with different abilities. Park says he had already told him not to worry, and more importantly, asked what he was doing with his phone when he saw him for the first time. The boy then responds he was streaming on YouTube, asking if by chance Park didn't know about it. Asking if he lived in a cave, the protagonist responds yes, as it was pretty much like that. Taking out his phone, Han says it was called YouTube. He then begins to show him all the features it had. Shortly after, Park says he was really a good person. A while later, the two had already left the house, and the boy thinks his partner had everything it took to become the next YouTube star. Moreover, he was quite a stud and had a perfect body, which is why he even appeared in the headlines for breaking a world record. For that reason, if Park demonstrated combat power in dungeon incursions, it would probably be just a matter of time before he caught the attention of all the guilds. Then Park responds he really liked the boy, asking him to join his clan. Han, surprised, asks if by chance he was planning to create his own clan and if he wasn't interested in joining a guild. However, the young man responds he didn't want that. Han, for his part, wondered what would happen if he made a video about the clan's creation, and went on dungeon incursions with the best candidate from the year's mercenary test. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the boy falling to the ground. Boxing was the only thing that helped him endure that rotten childhood he had. Despite continuing to fail, he managed to get a professional license. Even so, he would lose hope, but great disasters shattered all of his hopes and dreams. And they say, hope is the last thing to die, which is why he ended up becoming a YouTuber. Back in the present, Han thinks this was what he had been looking for, since he couldn't believe such an opportunity was right in front of him, saying he was willing to do anything for the protagonist. Park, pleased, says he's starting to like him more, so he should ditch the stream. With tears on his face, the guy says he wouldn't go back on his word. Park, for his part, asks why he suddenly started crying, and Han replies it was nothing, asking if he knew he needed at least 3 members for a clan to be officially created. However, Park still didn't seem to know that. Shortly after, an unknown man enters the room. Han then asks why that monk was in that place. Then the man introduces himself, saying his name was Miyuki Jin, and that he was assigned to Team 15. At that moment, a device rings, saying candidates should put on their battle suits. They were to meet in the 3rd floor conference room within 30 minutes. Park, along with Han, watches in surprise, wondering if they really wanted them to put on those suits at such an hour of the night. The protagonist asks if they weren't going into the dungeons the next day. Miyuki Jin responds it was said that sometimes the Reapers made dungeon incursions at night without any prior notice. Han replies it was crazy because they were doing it without warning. Then the scene cuts to the room with all the students, saying the dungeon would be part of the test, and it was located in the 5th sector of Suwon, which was under the Phoenix Guild's protection. For that reason, it was a level 1 dungeon with a total of 250 doors. Park, for his part, asked what it meant to be under protection. Han, in disbelief, was still surprised because the protagonist really didn't know anything. With doors appearing everywhere, the South Korean government found it difficult to manage all of them. So, the government hired private mercenary clans to protect the 12 sectors. The guild is the name given to a private mercenary clan contracted by the government in exchange for its services. Guilds gain rights to process the dimensional energy of the dungeons they manage. Park, for his part, asks if it was basically a tax-free zone where they could hunt, and Han responds it was pretty much like that. The boy thinks he just wanted to form a clan because he missed hunting with his pack. However, now he could even get his own land. Han replies it was great to have his own dungeon because that way he wouldn't have to pay to use it. Park replies the goal of his clan was to become a guild. However, Han asks if they shouldn't worry about passing the mercenary test first, wondering if the protagonist was pretending to be dumb. Shortly after, that guy says this was an image of the portal's location in Sector 5, and that dungeon had only 15 days left before it broke. It was a labyrinth-type dungeon, which had the lowest difficulty level and the fewest monsters of all the dungeons. It was a shame they wouldn't be able to obtain much dimensional energy since the monsters there were extremely weak. Anyway, that was all the man had to say about the dungeon's explanation. Han wonders what that was about because the monsters might not be their biggest problem. If they weren't careful, they could end up getting stuck in the labyrinth. For that reason, if they at least had a tracking ability, half of their problems could be solved. However, Park replies he had that ability, leaving the boy very surprised by what he heard, wondering if he had really learned that ability before taking the mercenary test because that ability was extremely expensive. Supposing the protagonist was probably from a rich family and born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Meanwhile, that monk was still standing next to Park. Then Han asks if he had any awakened abilities, so the man remains silent, leaving the two confused by the situation. At that moment, he pulls out some kind of tool. The scene cuts to a flashback of him. Several monsters surround that house, which quickly advance towards the place, heading toward the monk, starting to completely destroy the house. Shortly after, another monk opens the door and asks them to stop the noise immediately. Miyuki Jin asks what he was doing at that hour of the night. The man then requests the priest be taken with him and the area be evacuated immediately. At that moment, a monster appears behind him, and it is swiftly defeated by him. Back in the present, that man seemed to have a frightened expression. Han asks why he looked so scared. The other man then replies that from that moment on, they were going to the marked target. Therefore, they should begin attacking the dungeon as a team led by the supervisor. He hoped everyone would pass the test and that no one would fail. Shortly after, everyone was heading toward the portal. The soldiers asked everyone to get off the bus, asking if everyone was prepared. Once they entered, they were to act as if they weren't there and follow the agreement. Han says his team was the only one with 3 members, so he asks if in case things got dangerous, the supervisor would really help them. However, the man ignores the question and tells them to move quickly. Park asks why Han is so scared. He asks if they were allowed to use their personal weapons. The soldier responds that they were. Surprised, Han wonders if that monk had a weapon made of dimensional material for the mercenary tests. Meanwhile, the entry of each group into the portal was being completed. Soon after, the soldier tells the group to enter, so Team 15 enters the portal. Han wonders why Park always goes ahead, which makes him nervous. He asks the boy to establish a perimeter first, but at that moment he falls silent, thinking he had lost points for not entering quietly and not holding his position. As a consequence, he ends up attracting the attention of monsters, and one is already in front of the protagonist. Within seconds, the boy grabs the monster and defeats it. Han comments making noise to catch them off guard and lure them into a trap could be a good idea. He asks if the boy was using tracking while advancing, but at that moment he steps on a trap, and within seconds, several arrows begin firing at them. The scene cuts to a dragon being showered with gunfire. That monk had apparently defeated all the monsters around. With tears in his eyes, he apologizes, saying it was all his fault. So the monster is obliterated. The scene cuts back to Park's fight. Han, observing the protagonist's skills with the staff, mentions he was very good. However, he steps on another trap, and as a result, they fall to the floor below. The door apparently closes, leaving everyone trapped in a dungeon. Looking up, they all realize the opening had been sealed. Han, desperate, wonders if this is how all his dreams disappeared, and if they were really going to die there. But in that same instant, he realizes something, saying they thought they had really attracted more monsters. Then the monk apologizes, mentioning his awakened ability was an area-wide provocation, which as a consequence attracted the attention of the monsters. Park says that's great because he was too lazy to hunt for all the monsters to kill. Shortly after, he jumps out of the dungeon, leaving Han surprised, wondering how someone could kick so hard. Park says he really liked the monk and that he should join his clan. However, that man still didn't seem to understand the situation. Shortly after, a massive horde of monsters appears. Park observes them coldly, and Han begins to use his tracking ability. Seeing all the targets in front of him and all the traps around, he quickly starts running. Han thinks they really messed up. Then that monk points his staff at Han, asking him to grab it and climb out. Han says he didn't know anything anymore since the operation was not what they had planned. When they stand up, they are surprised because the horde of monsters had already been defeated by Park. Observing this, the boy thinks it's insane. Park then asks them to follow him and be careful with the ones who are knocked out. The two do as the boy asked, starting to defeat the remaining monsters. Surprised, the monk wonders if the protagonist was avoiding the traps or using tracking. For that reason, he was advancing at incredible speed, decimating the monsters while using the traps to his advantage. Looking up, he sees a monster behind the protagonist. However, the monk saves him, throwing his staff toward the skeleton. Shortly after, the system informs Park he acquired 42 conquest points. The scene cuts to an agency. The other soldier says a team is returning from the dungeon And the other soldier is surprised because only a few minutes had passed since the test began. He mentions the dungeon usually takes 2 hours to finish, wondering if an accident had occurred. However, the man says it was Team 20 and all vital signs were normal. Shortly after, that gentleman receives a call. Answering it, he says it was the supervisor asking why they were returning so early, and the soldier on the other end of the line confirms they had completed the mission. He would understand when he watched the video, but it would be difficult to assess his performance in a level 1 dungeon. Additionally, Park had broken a performance record inside the dungeon. The scene then cuts to the city. Han starts a live stream saying they would be doing daily streams about his clan. One of the viewers asks what they would show today, and the boy replies they were going to watch the video of Suho clan's house together since it would be uploaded soon. He then shows where each person's dormitory was. Next, he goes to the protagonist grandmother's house, asking her to take a look at his subscribers. The grandmother, irritated, says she had many things to do instead of worrying about that. She tells the boy to leave before she sliced him. Hearing this, Han falls silent, thinking she wasn't usually like that. She was actually a very nice person. Then Han heads to the room where the protagonist and the monk are. In the middle of the stream, Han introduces the monk, saying his name was Mong Jin. He asks the boy to say something to introduce himself. The monk replies he had lost a lot in the attack of the evil spirits, but was left with a staff of clairvoyance that his eldest disciple had left behind. At that moment, a truck arrives at the house, and the protagonist's brother asks if he was ready, so everyone starts heading toward the truck. As they go to the location, a drone flies overhead. Park wonders what that thing flying was and if he should destroy it. Han is surprised because he didn't know. He says at the moment they were heading to the mission area in Area 4 of Gate 30. That nearby portal meant today was their first dungeon mission as a clan. Returning to the stream, the boy asks if his subscribers knew he had an awakened ability that was video memory, so they shouldn't panic because soon there would be an even better video. Sometime later, the protagonist and his group had already entered the dungeon. Han asks if the boy had any long-range abilities, and the protagonist replies he didn't. Han, confused, asks how they were going to deal with those bats without such an ability. However, the monk tells him to leave it to him. At that moment, he starts beating on some kind of drum, making a deafening noise. As a result, the entire horde of bats begins moving toward them. Han, surprised, wonders why they were coming out like that. Shortly after, those bats head toward the monk, where he apparently starts using a fire ability. However, it wasn't over yet since a giant bat appears, but it was no use because Park had already sliced it in half, so the mission seemed to be complete. Park mentions the gate had opened, so they should hurry. Observing all the madness that had happened, the viewers seemed quite in disbelief. Then the scene cuts to Miso's office, who apparently wasn't believing what she was seeing. The other guy says with the thirst those people had in Area 4, the three of them were capable of finishing even 20 dungeons a day. Moreover, they were completely decimating all the level 1 dungeons. Taking out his phone, he observes that streamer's channel from earlier. Miso says she had done a lot to keep the protagonist out of the news, but unfortunately one of his guild members was a streamer. She mentions Park's videos were now ranked 3rd in real-time popularity, so if they left it alone, it would only grow more, asking if they shouldn't take some precautions. The girl, for her part, says she was well aware of that. Meanwhile, she seemed to be watching a video of a fight between two people, and that guy seemed to have easily won the battle. The other person watching was named Lee Sung-woo, an SS rank irregular born in South Korea. Wondering what would happen if the country approached him carelessly under the pretext of protecting a talent and ended up having to deal with a second, Lee Sung-woo. She stands up asking them to prepare to make contact with the protagonist, and for that reason, she would meet him personally. Shortly after, the scene cuts back to the protagonist's house. Hans, for his part, asks if the monk didn't have work to do. Park wonders where he would go since he didn't have a temple of any sort. Juno replies he had mentioned he was living in Seoul with a temple family that survived that day. Noticing Han's irritation, Juno asked the creature couldn't at least rest for a day since his clan was ready to renew its rank. Moreover, his clan's account had already accumulated 140 million won in total, leaving the boy very surprised by what he had heard, thinking he had done nothing but gather the blood crystals, yet his account already had 20 million in 3 days. Park, observing this, remains silent, and the boy continues saying, it was insane because if it were true, they would get many donations. Park thinks he had earned more than 3,000 conquest points, so he should buy some varied abilities since he could get everything now. So he responds he would take that day to rest. Standing up, Juno says he would take his son and grandmother to the park near that place. Meanwhile, that elderly woman seemed to be feeding the dog. Observing the little dog, Park wonders if dogs by chance could awaken like humans. Shortly after, he calls for his brother, mentioning he had been fixing the truck quite often and asking if it wasn't difficult. Juno replies he didn't even know where to start and that it was already hard enough to find the parts, but fixing it was exhausting. Then Park asks if he didn't want to buy a new car, leaving Juno very happy with what he had heard. Sometime later, the two seem to be discussing with the manager about which car to get. The man starts explaining the car many times in detail. Park asks if his brother liked it, and Juno quickly responds that he did. With his choice made, Park says he intends to pay in cash, asking if they could drive off immediately. Shortly after, the two leave the place with their new car. Juno seems very happy, saying the car was incredible and was on a completely different level compared to what he had before. Park mentions even the passenger seat in that car was amazing and he should have bought it a long time ago. Juno then asks why they were heading to Area 34, wondering if it wasn't a restricted area. The protagonist questions if he had mentioned he couldn't awaken because he didn't have the money, and for that reason, they were going to awaken that day. Shortly after, a scene cuts to the two arriving at the predetermined location. Looking around, there were several destroyed houses. Meanwhile, Juno didn't seem confident about the situation, and the other dog appeared to be on high alert. Park asks if the dog could also sense that smell because that odor was definitely from a goblin. Juno replies he wasn't feeling comfortable and asks if they could leave. Shortly after, Park steps out of the car, saying he would be back soon so they should wait with the dog, and he quickly jumps away from the place. Juno didn't seem very pleased with that. Shortly after, the scene cuts to another location. A group of people appeared to be watching the video of the protagonist with his group. The other man says he was very popular on YouTube, saying he was an irregular, which is why his combat level was immeasurable. Then the other man says if he was at that level, it was useless to even hire an assassin. However, even so, they couldn't just leave him alone. The other guy then asks for a list of guilds in Area 4 that had frequent sponsorships. So he remembers the name, but there was another person who was better suited for the situation, asking to contact him and offering as much money as necessary for the job. Sometime later, the scene cuts again while it's raining in the city. That elderly woman from earlier while walking thinks she should do the laundry. Shortly after, a car pulls up beside her and a group of people gets out asking if the woman's name was Sukya, saying they were from the returnees department. They ask if they could meet with Park. Hearing what the girl said, the woman remains silent. Then once again, the scene cuts to Juno's car. In the middle of that rain, he mentions he couldn't see anything, wondering what the protagonist could be doing. At that moment, the dogs seem to be on high alert. Within seconds, a goblin appears. However, it is easily defeated by someone, and Park shows up. Shortly after, the two step out of the car. More monsters begin to appear. Park then hands a dagger to his brother, asking him to follow while he kills them. Desperate, the boy asks him to wait a moment. Park, for his part, asks why Juno was hesitating. Juno then questions if it was really necessary for him to awaken. Park responds he couldn't survive if he remained weak, which is why he had to kill them quickly. Soon after, another goblin appears, rushing straight toward the dog. Park then tells the dog to bite the goblin. The dog leaps at the goblin, starting to bite the monster's arm. However, it still wasn't enough. Park says it's because the dog is too young, so if the goblin isn't weakened, the dog will likely die. So Juno should go help him, ordering his brother to kill the goblin. However, Juno still seemed reluctant to do it. Meanwhile, the dog was on the verge of being devoured, but Juno suddenly changes his mind and rushes at the monster. He manages to stab it, saving the dog's life, but it still wasn't enough, and Park tells him to continue. Juno then begins a series of attacks again. Everything was done, and his hand was covered in ketchup-like blood, completely desperate at what he was witnessing. Park tells him to pick up the knife again, but Juno replies he really couldn't do it. Park responds that if he didn't kill, he would likely die. Once again, the dogs seem to be on high alert. Another goblin appears. Park once again tells him to follow, while he kills the monsters because they were running out of time. Desperate, the boy has a flashback from before when he was being bullied by those people. At that time, Park had simply ignored his brother, leaving him alone in that situation. However, now things had changed, and Park was doing everything he could to help him. Seeing as all of this, Juno's facial expression changes. He seems to accept everything with open arms. He then picks up the dagger again, saying it was true because he had always been like this. He then charges at the monster, easily attacking it, telling it to shut up and just die. He then splits its face in half, starting a series of attacks while the monster was on the ground. Shortly after, everything was done, and the ketchup-like blood was running in the rain. Juno, for his part, seemed to have changed a lot because now, instead of being afraid, he had a terrifying look in his eyes. At that moment, another goblin appears. However, Juno notices it, managing to block the monster's attack. Both of them fall to the ground, but Juno still manages to finish off the monster. He quickly gets up, thinking the feeling he was having was very good. Meanwhile, Park was standing on top of a building watching his brother. Surprised, the name Juno had been given was Butcher, mentioning his brother was evolving and that it was really cute. Park then asks if his brother had worked part-time at a slaughterhouse. With a threatening look, Juno replies, "No!" Park then calls for his brother, who with a threatening gaze begins to approach the protagonist. On top of the building where Park was, several monster bodies were lined up. The boy says he was going to take a rest there. The scene then cuts to the Awakened Association. Juno, alongside his brother, was completely covered in ketchup-like blood. The other woman, surprised, wonders what had happened. Park, for his part, replies he had just awakened. The woman then asks him to take a bath at least and be re-examined to check for any kind of disease. Afterward, he could go to the dimensional energy measurement room on the 3rd floor. As they climb the stairs, Juno asks what the woman had said about the meter. Park responds it was a machine that measures dimensional energy and the number needs to be higher than 100 to be registered as an F rank awakened. He mentions